the prophet who did the impossible, and why no one talks about him. The kind that presses against your chest like a weight you cannot lift. A man stands alone in the wilderness, his weathered hands trembling as he grips a simple wooden staff. The sun burns overhead, yet shadows seem to dance around him, defying the laws of light itself. His name was Elisha. You have never heard his story the way it deserves to be told. History remembers the thunder of his master Elijah, the prophet who called down fire from heaven and ascended in a whirlwind. But what of the quiet man who inherited twice the power? What of the one who made iron float, who fed thousands with scraps, who brought the dead back to life with nothing more than prayer and faith? This is the story of the forgotten miracle worker, the man who performed more supernatural acts than any prophet in history, yet whose name barely echoes in our modern consciousness. He walked among kings and beggars alike, turning impossibility into reality with a humility that made him nearly invisible to the pages of fame. Today you will discover why Elisha remains history's most overlooked messenger of the divine. You will witness miracles that defy every law of physics, acts of power that would make headlines for centuries if they happened today. More importantly, you will understand why his story matters now more than ever. In a world drowning in noise, Elisha whispered. In an age of spectacle, he served in silence, yet his quiet revolution changed everything. The impossible was his daily bread, and somehow we forgot to tell his story. The ancient world was a place where the line between the physical and the spiritual ran thin as morning mist. In the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, around 850 years before Christ walked the earth, every sunrise brought the possibility of the miraculous, and every sunset carried the weight of divine judgment. This was the world into which Elisha was born, though his early years remained shrouded in the kind of obscurity that would later define his entire ministry. Unlike the dramatic entrances of other biblical figures, Elisha emerged from the common soil of agricultural life in Abel Meholah, a small town whose name means meadow of dancing. Perhaps there was prophecy even in that, for his life would become a dance between the mundane and the miraculous, between the plow and the palace. The air in those days was thick with political tension. The northern kingdom of Israel, where Elisha would spend his ministry, was caught in a deadly embrace with the worship of Baal, the Canaanite storm god whose temples dotted the landscape like infected wounds. King Ahab ruled from his ivory palace in Samaria, while his Phoenician queen Jezebel imported priests and practices that made the very stones of the land cry out in protest. Yet it was also a time when the voice of the true God had not fallen silent. The prophet Elijah, whose name meant "My God is Yahweh," had already begun his thunderous campaign against the forces of idolatry. He was a man of fire and wind, of dramatic confrontations and spectacular displays of divine power. When Elijah spoke, the heavens listened. When he prayed, the rain stopped for 3.5 years. When he called upon his God, fire fell from the sky to consume not just sacrifice, but altar, stones, dust, and water. In the shadow of such volcanic spiritual activity, a young farmer named Elisha tended his father's oxen. The biblical record tells us he was the son of Shaphat, but gives us no genealogies, no royal connections, no dramatic birth narratives. He was, by all appearances, ordinary. His hands were calloused from the plow, his back bent from labor, his eyes focused on the furrows he cut in the ancient earth. But the divine rarely announces itself with trumpets in the hearts of the chosen. More often it whispers in the quiet moments between one task and another, in the space between the breath taken and the breath released. Elisha's preparation for his extraordinary calling came not through visions or angelic visitations, but through the patient rhythm of agricultural life. There is something profound about this agricultural beginning that we must not overlook. In a culture that revered the dramatic and the spectacular, God was preparing a servant whose greatest strength would be his ability to see the sacred in the simple. Every sunrise that found Elisha behind his plow was teaching him about faithfulness. Every season of planting and harvest was inscribing upon his heart the rhythms of divine provision. Every day of ordinary labor was building in him the character that would later channel extraordinary power with unprecedented humility. The 12 yoke of oxen that Elisha managed tell us something significant about his family's status. This was not the equipment of poverty, but neither was it the wealth of kings. His family occupied that crucial middle ground of rural prosperity, comfortable enough to contribute to the community, humble enough to understand the struggles of ordinary people. It was the perfect background for a ministry that would serve both peasants and princes with equal grace. As Elisha worked his fields, the reputation of Elijah was growing throughout the land. Stories traveled with the merchants and pilgrims who passed through Abel Meholah. Tales of drought and deliverance, of widow's oil that never ran dry, of a boy raised from death in an upper room. These stories would have reached Elisha's ears during the long evenings when families gathered to share the news of the day. Did he wonder as he guided his oxen through the furrows if he would ever be called to something greater? Did he look up from his work to scan the horizon for the prophet whose fame was spreading like fire through dry grass? Or was he content with the certainty of seed and soil, the predictable cycles of rain and harvest? The biblical narrative gives us no insight into Elisha's inner life during these preparatory years. But human nature suggests he must have felt the stirring that comes to every soul destined for more than the circumstances of their birth seem to promise. There must have been moments when the ordinary felt insufficient, when the weight of untapped potential pressed against the boundaries of his daily routine. Yet perhaps this very contentment with the ordinary was what made him suitable for the extraordinary calling that was approaching like a storm on the horizon. In a world obsessed with power and prestige, God was preparing a man who could wield unprecedented supernatural authority without losing his connection to the soil from which he came. The fields of Abel Meholah were becoming a classroom, though neither teacher nor student yet knew the curriculum. Every day of faithful labor was building the foundation for a ministry that would reshape the understanding of what it meant to serve as a messenger of the divine. In the quiet space between one furrow and the next, between one season and another, between one ordinary day and the next, destiny was taking shape in the calloused hands of a farmer who had no idea his life was about to change forever. The stage was set, the character was formed, all that remained was for the call to come. The morning of Elisha's calling dawned like any other, with the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as naturally as the leather harness he placed upon his oxen. There was comfort in the routine, in the knowledge that this day, like thousands before it, would be measured in furrows plowed and ground prepared for the coming season's seed. But there was also something ring in the air else stir that morning. Something that made the birds sing with unusual intensity and caused the oxen to lift their heads as if listening for a sound their human master could not yet hear. The spiritual atmosphere was charged with the kind of expectancy that precedes great revelations, though Elisha remained focused on the earthly task before him. As the son of Shaphat, Elisha had inherited more than land and livestock. He had inherited a reputation for reliability, for the kind of steady faithfulness that made him the man neighbors turned to when they needed someone they could trust. His word was his bond, his handshake as binding as any written contract. In a world where political alliances shifted like sand and religious loyalties changed with the prevailing winds, Elisha had become known as someone whose character was as solid as the bedrock beneath his fields. Yet this very reliability might have made his future calling seem impossible to those who knew him best. Prophets were known for their unpredictability, for the wild intensity that seemed to burn in their eyes and the urgent passion that drove them to confront kings and challenge kingdoms. They were men of the wilderness, of caves and mountaintops, of dramatic gestures and spectacular confrontations. What place could there be in such a calling for a man whose greatest skill was the patient cultivation of ordinary ground? The answer lay not in what Elisha lacked, but in what he possessed in abundance. His years behind the plow had cultivated in him something far more valuable than dramatic intensity. They had developed his capacity for faithful presence, for showing up day after day regardless of circumstances or feelings. This quality, invisible to those who measured greatness by its ability to generate headlines, was precisely what would make his future ministry so unprecedented in its scope and effectiveness. As Elisha guided his team through the morning's work, his mind was likely occupied with the practical concerns that filled the thoughts of every farmer. The rains had been adequate but not abundant. The soil was ready, but timing would be crucial for the planting season ahead. There were decisions to be made about which fields to plant first, which crops would bring the best return, how to allocate resources for maximum benefit. But beneath these surface concerns, something deeper was stirring. Call it intuition, call it spiritual sensitivity, or simply call it the mysterious way the human heart sometimes knows that change is coming before the mind can process the evidence. Elisha had been experiencing a growing sense that his life was moving toward some kind of threshold, though he could not have articulated what that threshold might be. It was not dissatisfaction with his current circumstances that created this sense of approaching change. Unlike many who are called to great purposes, Elisha was not running from his present life, but rather seemed to be growing into it. His contentment with agricultural life was genuine, his commitment to his family's prosperity sincere. Yet contentment and calling are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, it often seems that those who are most faithful in small things are the ones chosen for greater responsibilities. The 12 yoke of oxen under his care represented not just economic value, but a kind of stewardship that was shaping his understanding of responsibility itself. Each animal required individual attention while remaining part of a coordinated team. Each had its own temperament and needs, yet all had to work together to accomplish the larger task. This daily experience of managing diversity for unified purpose was preparing him for a ministry that would require him to work with kings and commoners, soldiers and civilians, Israelites and foreigners, all while maintaining focus on the greater mission he would soon be called to serve. His relationship with his father Shaphat appears to have been one of mutual respect and shared purpose. There is no hint in the biblical narrative of the kind of generational conflict that often marks the early years of those called to radical departures from family tradition. Instead, we see the comfortable partnership of two men who understood their roles and fulfilled them with quiet competence. This harmonious family dynamic was creating in Elisha the emotional stability that would serve him well in the turbulent years ahead. As he worked that morning, Elisha was unknowingly in his final hours as a farmer. The skills he had developed, the character he had formed, the relationships he had built, all of these would soon be transformed into the foundation for an entirely different kind of life. But the transition would not erase what he had been. Instead, it would reveal that what he had been was preparation for what he was becoming. The sun climbed higher, the oxen maintained their steady pace, and Elisha continued his methodical progress across the field. He had no way of knowing that somewhere in the distance a wild-haired prophet was walking toward him with a divine commission that would change not just his own destiny, but the spiritual landscape of an entire nation. In these final moments of his ordinary life, Elisha embodied a truth that would define his entire ministry. The sacred is not separate from the mundane but is found within it, waiting to be recognized and released by those who have eyes to see and hearts to understand. The shadow fell across Elisha's field like a question mark written in darkness against the golden morning light. He felt it before he saw it, the way a deer senses the hunter's presence in the forest stillness. His hands, steady on the plow for countless seasons, began to tremble with an anticipation he could not name. The oxen, creatures of habit and routine, suddenly lifted their massive heads as one, their nostrils flaring as if catching a scent that carried messages from beyond the visible world. Something was coming, something that would change everything. In the distance, dust rose from the ancient road that connected the scattered villages of the Jordan Valley. It was not the familiar dust of merchant caravans or military patrols, but something different, something that seemed to dance in the air with its own purpose and rhythm. The very atmosphere around Elisha began to thicken with possibility, as if the ordinary world was holding its breath in preparation for the extraordinary. The stories had been multiplying like seeds in fertile ground. Elijah, the prophet whose name had become synonymous with divine power, was moving through the land with increasing urgency. The tales that reached Abel-Meholah spoke of miracles that defied comprehension, of a man who seemed to exist at the intersection of heaven and earth, equally at home in both realms yet fully committed to neither. Just weeks before, word had come of the contest on Mount Carmel, where Elijah had challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a spiritual duel that would determine once and for all which God truly ruled over Israel. The story was almost too incredible to believe. Fire from heaven, altars consumed in an instant, false prophets fleeing in terror, rain ending a 3-year drought at the prayer of a single man. But it was not just the spectacular miracles that made these stories so compelling. It was the way they were told, with the kind of detail that only comes from eyewitness accounts. The merchants who brought these tales spoke of Elijah's eyes, which seemed to hold depths that no mortal gaze should contain. They described his voice, which could whisper comfort to a widow and thunder judgment against a king with equal authority. They told of his presence, which could fill a room with peace or empty a palace with terror, depending on the spiritual temperature of those who encountered him. Elisha had listened to these accounts with the careful attention of a man who understood that truth often wore the garments of impossibility. His years of working with the earth had taught him that the most profound, revisible ones, seeds disappear realities, were often the least into darkness before they could bring forth light. Rain fell from empty skies when the need was greatest. Life emerged from apparent death with the regularity of sunrise. Yet even his agricultural understanding of the miraculous could not fully prepare him for what was approaching. The dust cloud on the horizon was not just the sign of a traveler, but the herald of destiny itself, announcing the arrival of a moment that had been prepared since the foundation of the world. As the figure in the distance grew more distinct, Elisha found himself caught between the desire to run toward the approaching stranger and the equally powerful urge to flee in the opposite direction. There was something about the silhouette that moved along the road that spoke of authority so absolute it was almost frightening. This was not a man who could be ignored, dismissed, or forgotten. This was someone whose very presence demanded a response. The oxen, sensitive to their master's emotional state, began to show signs of restlessness. They pawed the ground and shifted in their traces as if they too sensed that the familiar rhythms of their daily routine were about to be shattered forever. Their large, gentle eyes turned toward Elisha with what seemed almost like sympathy, as if they understood that he was about to lose something precious and irreplaceable. But what was he about to lose? His life was good, his future secure, his place in the community established and respected. The fields he had inherited from his father were productive, his livestock healthy, his reputation unblemished. By every measure that mattered in his world, Elisha was a successful man with every reason to be content with his circumstances. Yet contentment and calling rarely occupied the same space in the human heart. Deep within his chest, in a place he rarely allowed his conscious mind to examine, Elisha carried a hunger that no amount of agricultural success could satisfy. It was not dissatisfaction with his present circumstances, but rather a growing awareness that his present circumstances might be preparation for something entirely different. The approaching figure had stopped at the edge of his field, and now Elisha could see him clearly. The man was tall and lean, with hair that seemed to have been styled by the wind itself and clothes that spoke of long journeys through difficult terrain. But it was his eyes that captured Elisha's attention and held it with an intensity that was both compelling and unsettling. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. Those eyes were now fixed on Elisha with a directness that made him feel as if every secret thought and hidden motivation was being examined and weighed. Yet there was no judgment in that gaze, only a kind of recognition, as if the stranger was confirming something he had already known to be true. The moment stretched between them like a bridge spanning two different worlds. On one side stood Elisha's past, with its familiar patterns and comfortable certainties. On the other side waited his future, vast and unknown and full of possibilities that both thrilled and terrified him. The stranger at the edge of his field represented the choice that every human soul must eventually make between safety and significance, between the known and the called. As Elisha stood there, his hands still gripping the plow that had been his constant companion for so many years, he realized that this moment had been approaching all his life. Every furrow he had cut in the earth had been leading to this encounter. Every season of faithful labor had been building toward this choice. Every quiet evening of wondering if there might be more to life than what he could see with his eyes had been preparing him for this test of faith and courage. The stranger began to move again, walking directly toward him with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. With each step, the weight of destiny grew heavier in the air around them, until Elisha felt as if he were standing at the center of a storm that was about to reshape the landscape of his entire existence. His heart began to race with a mixture of fear and anticipation that he had never experienced before. This was the moment when whispers became voices, when possibilities became realities, when the sacred invaded the mundane with irresistible force. The prophet Elijah was coming to claim his successor. Time suspended itself like breath held too long. Elijah stood at the boundary between two worlds, his weathered hand extended toward a young man whose life was about to be rewritten in the space of a single heartbeat. The prophet's cloak, that legendary mantle that had become synonymous with divine authority itself, moved in his grasp with a weight that transcended its physical substance. This was not merely fabric. This was investiture. This was the tangible symbol of a calling that stretched back through generations of chosen messengers, each one carrying the sacred flame from one age to the next. And now that flame was being offered to a farmer whose hands still bore the soil of ordinary earth. Elisha felt the moment crystallize around him like water turning to ice. Everything he had ever been, everything he had ever known, everything he had ever planned for his future hung in the balance of this singular instant. The cloak moved through the air with deliberate slowness, as if even heaven itself wanted to savor this moment of transition. When the mantle touched his shoulders, the world exploded into silence. It was not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something so profound that ordinary noise became irrelevant. Elisha felt as if he had been standing in a shallow stream his entire life, only to suddenly find himself plunged into the depths of an ocean whose bottom could not be fathomed. The sensation was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, like learning to breathe underwater while discovering that water was not the enemy he had always believed it to be. The weight of the cloak was nothing compared to the weight of understanding that began to settle upon his consciousness. Images flashed through his mind with startling clarity, visions of a future he had never imagined but somehow recognized as his own destiny. He saw himself standing before kings and beggars with equal authority. He witnessed miracles flowing through his hands like water from a spring that would never run dry. He felt the burden of carrying divine messages to a world that would often refuse to listen. But more than the visions, more than the supernatural revelations, Elisha experienced something that transformed him at the cellular level. It was the overwhelming awareness that he was no longer alone. The God who had seemed distant and mysterious throughout his years in the fields was suddenly, undeniably, intimately present, not as a concept to be understood or a force to be appeased, but as a companion whose presence would never leave him, whose power would flow through him, whose love would sustain him through whatever trials lay ahead. Elijah watched the transformation with eyes that had seen this miracle before, yet never ceased to be moved by it. The moment of calling was always the same and always different, always mysterious and always perfectly clear. He had experienced his own version of this encounter years before, when the divine voice had found him in his despair and commissioned him for a ministry that would shake kingdoms and reshape nations. Now he was watching his successor receive the same impossible gift, the same overwhelming responsibility, the same sacred burden that would define the rest of his earthly existence. There was both joy and sorrow in Elijah's weathered face as he witnessed this passing of the torch. Joy for Elisha, who was about to discover depths of purpose and power he had never dreamed possible. Sorrow for himself as he recognized that his own earthly ministry was moving toward its conclusion. The oxen, those patient witnesses to countless ordinary days, seemed to understand that something extraordinary was occurring. They stood perfectly still, their large eyes fixed on their master as if they were watching him transform from one kind of being into another. Even the wind held its breath, creating a cathedral of stillness around the two men whose lives were being forever altered by forces beyond human comprehension. Elisha's mind struggled to process what was happening to him. The logical part of his consciousness insisted that this must be some kind of hallucination, some heat-induced fantasy brought on by too many hours in the sun. But his spirit knew better. His spirit recognized truth when it encountered it, regardless of how impossible that truth might seem to his rational mind. The mantle was more than symbol now. It was conduit, connection, commissioning. Through its worn fibers flowed the accumulated authority of every prophet who had ever stood between heaven and earth, translating the incomprehensible into language that human hearts could understand. Moses had carried this authority when he led a nation out of bondage. Samuel had wielded it when he anointed kings and challenged rulers. Elijah had embodied it when he called down fire from heaven and ended 3 years of drought with a single prayer. And now, it was Elisha's to carry. The responsibility was staggering, to speak words that carried the weight of divine authority, to perform acts that would serve as signs and wonders for generations yet unborn, to stand as a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, helping ordinary people understand that the extraordinary was always present, always available, always ready to break into their mundane existence with transforming power. But even more daunting than the miraculous was the mundane. To love people who would reject him, to serve those who would misunderstand his motives, to remain faithful when faithfulness seemed pointless, humble when power could corrupt, gentle when gentleness would be mistaken for weakness. As the initial shock of the encounter began to settle into a deeper understanding, Elisha became aware of Elijah watching him with eyes that held both compassion and expectation. The older prophet had walked this path of calling and commissioning. He understood the overwhelming nature of what Elisha was experiencing, but he also knew that understanding would come gradually through experience rather than explanation. "Do you accept?" Elijah asked, though the question was really a formality. The mantle had already chosen its new bearer. The divine current was already flowing through Elisha's being like electricity through copper wire. The transformation had already begun at levels too deep for conscious awareness to fully grasp. Elisha looked down at his hands, still calloused from years of gripping plow handles, now destined to channel power that could heal the sick and raise the dead. He thought of his father who would need to find other help for the harvest. He considered his comfortable life, his secure future, his place in the community that would all be sacrificed for an uncertain calling whose demands he could not yet fully comprehend. Yet beneath all these practical concerns, something deeper was stirring. A recognition that his entire life had been preparation for this moment. Every act of faithfulness in small things had been building his capacity for faithfulness in great things. Every quiet morning behind the plow had been developing his ability to hear the whisper of the divine voice. Every ordinary day had been extraordinary preparation for an extraordinary calling. The choice was no choice at all. It was simply the external confirmation of what had already been decided in the hidden places of his heart before he was born. "I accept," he whispered, and the words carried across the field like seeds on the wind, planting possibilities in soil that had been prepared since the foundation of the world. The moment the acceptance passed his lips, Elisha felt something shift in the very fabric of reality around him. The air itself seemed to shimmer with potential. The ground beneath his feet felt more solid, as if it recognized him as someone who now carried authority from realms beyond its own. The sky above appeared more vast, as if it were opening to welcome him into mysteries he had never suspected existed. This was how prophets were born, not through dramatic announcements or angelic visitations, but through quiet moments of surrender when ordinary human beings said yes to extraordinary divine purposes. In fields and on mountainsides, in temples and in wilderness places. The sacred had always found its way into the mundane through the simple willingness of chosen hearts to be transformed. Elisha would never be the same. More than that, the world itself would never be the same. Because another voice had been added to the ancient chorus of those who spoke heaven's language into earth's chaos, who carried divine light into human darkness, who served as living proof that the impossible was simply another word for the inevitable when divine purpose met human surrender. The oxen could return to their grazing now. The plow could rest until other hands took up its handles. A farmer had become a prophet, and the age of miracles was about to begin in earnest. The fire crackled between them as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, and Elijah began to speak of things that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. "You have asked for a double portion," the old prophet said, his eyes reflecting flames that seemed to burn with more than mere wood and spark. "Do you understand what you are asking?" Elisha sat in the gathering darkness, his mind still reeling from the events of the day. Hours had passed since the moment the mantle had first touched his shoulders. Yet his consciousness continued to expand like a vessel being stretched to contain more than it was ever designed to hold. The familiar world of fields and livestock had not disappeared, but it had been revealed as merely the surface layer of a reality whose depths he was only beginning to fathom. The request for a double portion had emerged from some place within him that he had not known existed. It was not arrogance that drove the petition, but rather a sudden, overwhelming awareness of the magnitude of what lay ahead. The spiritual darkness that covered the land was not something that could be dispelled by ordinary means or half-hearted efforts. It would require power that exceeded anything that had been seen before. Miracles that would shake the foundations of unbelief. Signs and wonders that would leave no room for doubt about the reality of divine presence in human affairs. "I understand," Elisha replied, though even as he spoke the words he knew that true understanding would come only through experience. "The people have forgotten how to see. They look at their circumstances and see only impossibility. They face their challenges and believe only in defeat. They need someone who can show them that with God nothing is truly impossible." Elijah nodded slowly, but his expression remained grave. "A double portion of power means a double portion of responsibility. A double portion of miracles means a double portion of misunderstanding. Those who witness the impossible often prefer to explain it away rather than allow it to change their understanding of what is possible." As if summoned by the prophet's words, images began to form in Elisha's mind with startling clarity. He saw himself standing beside a river where iron floated on the surface like cork, defying every law of nature while amazed onlookers struggled to comprehend what their eyes were telling them. He witnessed himself speaking to empty jars that suddenly overflowed with oil, transforming poverty into abundance through nothing more than faith and divine favor. But the visions did not stop with the spectacular. He saw quieter miracles, more intimate interventions. A barren woman's arms filled with the child she had never dared to hope for. A dead boy's chest rising and falling with restored breath as a mother's tears of grief transformed into tears of joy. Poisoned water becoming pure, deadly food becoming nourishing. Hopeless situations becoming testimonies to the power of divine love. Yet interwoven with these scenes of triumph were darker images that made Elisha's spirit tremble. He saw faces twisted with hatred, voices raised in accusation, hands lifted in violence against the very one who had brought them healing and hope. He witnessed the peculiar madness that often seizes people when confronted with undeniable evidence of divine power, the tendency to destroy the messenger rather than accept the message. "The miracles will not be the hardest part," Elijah continued, as if reading the visions that were playing out in his successor's consciousness. The hardest part will be loving the people who witness the miracles and still choose to reject them. The hardest part will be remaining humble when power flows through your hands like water from a spring. The hardest part will be trusting God's timing when every fiber of your being wants to force solutions that require patience. Elisha felt the weight of these words settling into his bones like winter cold that penetrates every layer of clothing. The calling to prophetic ministry was not just an invitation to supernatural power, but a commissioning to supernatural love. It was not enough to perform miracles. He would need to perform them with a heart that remained tender toward those who would never appreciate them, grateful toward the God who made them possible, and wise enough to understand their true purpose. Tell me about the loneliness, Elisha said quietly, surprising himself with the directness of the question. But something in Elijah's bearing, some shadow that crossed his weathered features when he spoke of rejection and misunderstanding, suggested that the path of the prophet was often walked in solitude. The older man was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeing scenes from his own ministry playing out in the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent carrying burdens that no one else could fully understand. There will be times when you feel as if you are the only person in the world who can see clearly, Elijah said. Everyone around you will be accepting lies as truth, embracing destruction as progress, choosing darkness as light, and you will stand alone, speaking words that sound like madness to ears that have been deafened by deception. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky, and Elisha found himself thinking of all the ordinary evenings he had spent with his family, surrounded by familiar voices and comfortable conversation. That world was not gone, but his place in it had been forever altered. He would always be set apart now, marked by a calling that would make him both more and less than the man he had been. But you will not be alone, Elijah continued, and his voice carried a note of comfort that touched Elisha's heart like a warm hand on a cold shoulder. The God who calls you will sustain you. The power that flows through you will also flow around you, protecting and providing and guiding. And there will be others, perhaps not many, but some, who will recognize what they see when they witness the miraculous through your ministry. As the night deepened around them, Elijah began to share stories from his own years of prophetic service. He spoke of the widow whose oil never ran out, whose flour jar never emptied, whose faith in the midst of famine had provided a sanctuary for both prophet and promise. He described the dramatic confrontation on Mount Carmel, where fire from heaven had vindicated the name of the true God before hundreds of witnesses. Yet within days he had found himself fleeing for his life from a queen who refused to accept the evidence her own eyes had seen. The miracles are not for their own sake, Elijah explained. They are signs that point to something greater. They are glimpses of what reality looks like when heaven and earth are in perfect harmony. Every healing is a preview of the day when sickness will be no more. Every supernatural provision is a foretaste of abundance that will never end. Every dead person raised to life is a declaration that death itself will one day be defeated. Elisha felt something shifting deep within his understanding as these words took root in his consciousness. The calling he had received was not primarily about demonstrating power, but about revealing hope. It was not about proving God's ability to suspend natural laws, but about showing God's desire to restore natural order. Every miracle would be a love letter written by divine hands to human hearts that had forgotten how to believe in happy endings. Yet even this elevated understanding could not completely eliminate the fear that was growing alongside his faith. The responsibility was St. Carry messages that would determine agoring to the fate of nations, to perform acts that would influence the spiritual destiny of countless souls, to serve as a conduit for power that could heal or judge, restore or destroy depending on the heart that received it. What if I fail? Ugh. The question escaped his lips before he could stop it, carrying with it all the vulnerability of a man who was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what he had accepted. Elijah's eyes found his across the dying fire, and in them Elisha saw not condemnation for the doubt, but compassion for the honesty. "You will fail," the old prophet said gently. "Not in the ultimate sense, not in the ways that matter most, but in smaller ways that will teach you to depend more completely on the God who called you. You will make mistakes that will humble you. You will face situations that will exceed your wisdom. You will encounter problems that will require more power than you possess." The words should have been discouraging, but somehow they brought comfort instead. There was relief in knowing that perfection was not expected, that the calling came with grace to cover the inevitable shortcomings, that failure could become a teacher rather than a destroyer. "But remember this," Elijah continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "The God who chose you knew your limitations before he called you. The power that will work through you does not depend on your strength, but on your willingness. The miracles that will flow from your hands will succeed not because you are capable, but because he is faithful." As the fire burned down to glowing embers and the night settled fully around them, Elisha felt the final pieces of his old life falling away like leaves in autumn wind. Tomorrow would bring the first steps of a journey whose destination he could not see, whose challenges he could not predict, whose rewards he could not imagine. But tonight, in the space between calling and commissioning, between acceptance and action, between the familiar and the unknown, he sat with the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The impossible mission had become his mission, and somehow, impossibly, that felt like the most natural thing in the world. The double portion was his. Now he would discover what it meant to carry it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the prophetic school at Bethel, where young men gathered to study the ways of the divine, and older prophets shared the wisdom earned through years of faithful service. It should have been a place of welcome for Elisha, a sanctuary where his newfound calling would be understood and celebrated. Instead, he found himself facing the first test of his ministry in the place where he had expected to find the most support. "So you are Elijah's successor," said Malachi, one of the senior prophets whose reputation for wisdom was matched only by his reputation for skepticism. His eyes moved over Elisha with the calculating gaze of a merchant evaluating goods of questionable quality. You look rather ordinary for someone claiming to carry a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Eh. The other prophets gathered in the courtyard fell silent, their attention focused on this first encounter between the established order and the newly commissioned servant. Elisha felt the weight of their expectations, their doubts, their unspoken questions about whether this farmer from Abel Mahola could possibly measure up to the legendary prophet who had just been taken from them in a whirlwind of fire and wind. "I claim nothing for myself," Elisha replied quietly, his voice steady despite the churning in his chest. "I only know that I have been called to serve, and I will serve as faithfully as I am able." Malachi's eyebrows rose in what might have been surprise or amusement. "Called to serve," he says. "Do you hear that, brothers? As if calling were simply a matter of good intentions and humble words. As if the power to work miracles could be inherited like a family farm or passed down like a father's tools." Murmurs rippled through the gathered men, some nodding in agreement with Malachi's implied criticism, others watching Elisha with expressions that ranged from curiosity to sympathy. The younger prophets seemed more open to the possibility that God might work in unexpected ways, while the older ones carried the natural skepticism that comes from years of witnessing false claims and failed promises. Elisha understood their doubt. In their position, he might have felt the same way. Elijah had been a force of nature, a man whose very presence seemed to crackle with supernatural energy. His miracles had been dramatic, undeniable, spectacular in their scope and timing. He had called down fire from heaven, ended droughts with a prayer, outrun chariots in supernatural strength. How could anyone, especially someone with no previous prophetic experience, hope to follow in such footsteps? "Perhaps," suggested another prophet named Joash, his voice carrying a note of conciliation, "we should allow time to reveal the truth. If God has truly chosen this man, surely he will confirm it through signs and wonders. And if not," he shrugged, leaving the implication unspoken but clear. The suggestion seemed reasonable to most of the assembly, but Elisha could see in their faces that time was not a neutral judge. Every day that passed without dramatic miracles would be interpreted as evidence of his inadequacy. Every challenge that he faced would be scrutinized for signs of failure. He was not being given the benefit of the doubt, but rather the burden of proof, and the standard of proof was the legendary ministry of a man who had been one of the most powerful prophets in Israel's history. Yet even as these thoughts troubled his mind, another voice was speaking in the deeper places of his spirit. It was not the voice of doubt or fear, but the gentle whisper of divine assurance that had been growing stronger since the moment Elijah's mantle had first touched his shoulders. The God who had called him was not intimidated by human skepticism. The power that would work through him was not diminished by the expectations of others. The mission he had been given would succeed not because people believed in it, but because heaven had ordained it. The resistance he was experiencing at Bethel was only the beginning. As news of his commissioning spread throughout the land, reactions ranged from curiosity to hostility, with very little falling in between. Some viewed him as a pretender trying to claim authority he had not earned. Others saw him as a poor substitute for the mighty Elijah. a disappointing replacement for a hero who could never truly be replaced. The political climate made his situation even more complex. Israel was in a state of spiritual confusion, torn between the worship of the true God and the seductive appeal of foreign deities that promised easier paths to prosperity and power. The royal court was filled with advisors who had no interest in hearing prophetic messages that might challenge their policies or expose their corruption. The religious establishment was divided between those who maintained orthodox faith and those who had compromised with popular trends for the sake of influence and comfort. Into this volatile atmosphere came Elisha, carrying a calling that would inevitably bring him into conflict with every power structure in the nation. Kings would summon him for counsel that they did not really want to hear. Priests would challenge his authority to speak in God's name. False prophets would compete with him for the attention and loyalty of the people. Military commanders would expect him to bless their campaigns regardless of their moral justification. But perhaps the most painful resistance came from ordinary people who had grown comfortable with a faith that demanded little and promised much. They wanted a God who would bless their plans without questioning their methods, who would provide for their needs without examining their motives, who would protect them from their enemies without requiring them to love their neighbors. Elisha's ministry would challenge all of these. Comfortable miracles would demonstrate assumptions. That divine power was real and available, but only to those who were willing to align themselves with divine purposes. His messages would offer hope and healing, but always in the context of righteousness and justice. His presence would bring the possibility of transformation, but transformation always required the painful process of acknowledging what needed to be changed. The resistance was not just external. Within his own heart, Elisha faced the ongoing battle between human nature and divine calling. There were moments when the criticism stung more than he wanted to admit, when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when the magnitude of the mission seemed too great for someone with his background and limitations. There were nights when he lay awake wondering if he had misunderstood his calling, if the mantle that had been placed on his shoulders was meant for someone else, someone more qualified, more experienced, more naturally gifted for the role of prophet and miracle worker. The doubt was subtle but persistent, whispering that he was inadequate for the task, that he would eventually be exposed as a fraud, that the power he thought he carried was nothing more than wishful thinking. Yet each morning brought fresh evidence that his calling was real and his commissioning authentic. Small miracles began to manifest around his ministry, quiet acts of divine intervention that confirmed to his own heart what others might question or deny. Water was purified by his prayer. Food was multiplied by his blessing. Sickness was healed by his touch. The supernatural began to flow through his hands with increasing frequency and power. Still, the resistance continued, and Elisha began to understand that it would always be a part of his ministry. People who witnessed undeniable miracles would find ways to explain them away or attribute them to natural causes. Those who received healing would sometimes forget the source of their restoration. Communities that benefited from his intervention would eventually return to their old patterns of thinking and living. This was the age of resistance, and he was learning to minister in its midst. not fighting against the opposition but flowing around it like water around stones, not demanding recognition but remaining faithful regardless of response, not seeking vindication, but trusting that truth would eventually vindicate itself. The prophets at Bethel would have their questions answered in time. The skeptics throughout the land would witness signs they could not deny. The power that had been promised would manifest in ways that left no room for doubt about its divine origin. But first, Elisha would have to learn the hardest lesson of prophetic ministry. That resistance was not his enemy, but his teacher, shaping him into the kind of vessel that could carry divine power without being corrupted by it, that could speak divine truth without being hardened by rejection, that could love divine purposes more than human approval. The age of resistance was preparing him for the age of miracles. The silence that followed Elisha's first public miracle was more deafening than any crowd's roar. He stood beside the spring at Jericho, watching crystal-clear water flow where moments before there had been only bitter poison. The salt he had cast into the source had dissolved completely, leaving no trace except the transformation it had wrought. Yet the faces surrounding him bore expressions that spoke not of wonder, but of a deeper unease that miracles often bring to hearts unprepared for their implications. "The water is indeed pure," admitted the city elder, his voice carrying the reluctant tone of someone forced to acknowledge what he would rather deny. "But how do we know it will remain so? How do we know this is not some temporary trick that will fade when you are gone?" The question hung in the air like incense, sweet with possibility yet bitter with doubt. Elisha understood that he was witnessing something far more profound than skepticism about a single miracle. He was confronting the fundamental human tendency to resist transformation, even when that transformation offers healing and hope. Around him, the people of Jericho whispered among themselves, their voices carrying the mixture of amazement and fear that always accompanies genuine encounters with divine power. They had prayed for years for someone to heal their poisoned spring. Yet now that their prayers had been answered, they seemed uncertain how to respond to the answer they had received. This was the paradox that would define much of Elisha's ministry. People desperately wanted their circumstances changed, but they were terrified of what those changes might require of them. They longed for miracles that would solve their problems without transforming their perspectives, for divine intervention that would improve their situations without challenging their assumptions about how the world worked. As the crowd began to disperse, some still glancing back at the spring as if expecting the water to revert to its former bitterness, Elisha felt the weight of understanding settling upon him like a mantle heavier than the one Elijah had placed on his shoulders. The miracles themselves were not the challenge. The challenge was helping people receive the miracles in ways that would transform their hearts rather than simply satisfy their immediate needs. In the days that followed, news of the healing at Jericho spread throughout the region with the speed that only supernatural events can achieve. But with the news came distortion, as stories passed from mouth to mouth, growing in some details while shrinking in others, until what had been a simple act of divine compassion became something far more complicated in the collective imagination. Some proclaimed Elisha as the greatest prophet who had ever lived. attributing to him powers and purposes that went far beyond anything he had claimed for himself. Others dismissed the entire event as mass hallucination or clever trickery, insisting that no genuine miracle could have occurred because genuine miracles did not fit their understanding of how the universe operated. Both responses troubled Elisha deeply, though for different reasons. The excessive praise threatened to inflate his sense of self-importance, to make him forget that he was merely a conduit for power that belonged entirely to God. The harsh criticism cut at his heart not because of wounded pride, but because it revealed how quickly people could close their minds to possibilities that challenged their established ways of thinking. Yet it was in the quiet moments between public ministry and private prayer that Elisha encountered his greatest challenges. Alone in his tent as evening shadows lengthened across the landscape, he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers, doubts that seemed to multiply rather than diminish as his ministry expanded. The visions came to him in these solitary hours, not as dramatic revelations accompanied by thunder and lightning, but as gentle unfoldings of understanding that revealed both the glory and the cost of his calling. He saw himself standing before kings who would summon him for counsel they did not want to hear, offering wisdom that would be rejected because it conflicted with their predetermined plans. He witnessed scenes of his own future that filiation and dread. Add him with both foreign general kneeling before him in gratitude for healing that transcended national boundaries, a room where death itself would be forced to retreat before, a siege where supernatural provision would sustain an entire city through impossible circumstances. But interwoven with these glimpses of triumph were darker images that made his spirit tremble. He saw the faces of those who would witness his miracles and remain unchanged, hearts so hardened by cynicism or selfishness that even the most dramatic displays of divine power could not penetrate their resistance. He felt the loneliness that would come from being perpetually misunderstood, even by those who claimed to support his ministry. Most troubling of all were the visions of his own internal struggles, the ongoing battle between human weakness and divine calling that would continue throughout his earthly service. He saw moments when discouragement would threaten to overwhelm his faith, when the magnitude of human suffering would seem too great for any amount of miraculous intervention to address adequately. In one particularly vivid vision, he watched himself weeping over the spiritual blindness of people who had witnessed undeniable miracles yet remained committed to their destructive patterns of thinking and living. The tears in the vision were his own, but they carried within them something of the divine grief that flows from perfect love confronting willful rejection. These nocturnal revelations served as both preparation and warning. They helped him understand that his ministry would require not just supernatural power but supernatural endurance, the ability to continue loving people who would not love him in return, to keep serving those who would not serve others, to maintain hope in the face of seemingly hopeless situations. As weeks turned to months, Elisha began to develop the internal resilience that would sustain him through decades of prophetic service. He learned to find his identity not in the responses of others, but in the unchanging character of the God who had called him. He discovered that true strength came not from avoiding difficulties, but from walking through them with divine companionship that never wavered regardless of external circumstances. The resistance he encountered was not merely human in origin. Behind the skepticism and hostility he faced was a spiritual opposition that recognized the threat his ministry posed to the forces of darkness that had gained influence throughout the land. Every miracle he performed was an act of warfare against the lies that kept people bound in hopelessness and despair. Yet even this understanding brought its own burdens. To recognize the spiritual dimensions of his calling was to accept responsibility not just for individual lives, but for the spiritual atmosphere of entire communities and regions. Each act of healing was a declaration that sickness was not the final word. Each supernatural provision was a proclamation that scarcity was not an unalterable reality. Each resurrection was an announcement that death itself was not the ultimate victor. The weight of such responsibility might have crushed someone who tried to carry it in human strength alone. But Elisha was learning the secret that would sustain him through every challenge ahead. The same divine power that worked through him to perform miracles was also working within him to provide the emotional and spiritual resources necessary for the journey. In the darkest hours, when doubt whispered its seductive lies and discouragement threatened to drain his motivation, he would remember the moment when Elijah's mantle had first touched his shoulders. He would recall the overwhelming sense of divine presence that had flooded his consciousness. The absolute certainty that he had been chosen not because of his qualifications, but because of God's faithfulness. These memories became anchors for his soul, fixed points of reference that remained stable even when everything else seemed to shift and change. They reminded him that his calling was not dependent on human approval or understanding, that his ministry's success was not measured by popular response, that his worth was not determined by the reactions of those he served. The moment arrived without fanfare in the quiet space between one breath and another, between one heartbeat and the next. Elisha stood in his tent as dawn painted the horizon in shades of hope, and suddenly understood with crystalline clarity what his entire ministry had been building toward. It was not the miracles themselves that mattered, nor the resistance he had overcome, nor even the lives he had touched along the way. It was something far more profound, something that would echo through the corridors of time long after his earthly voice had fallen silent. He was not just a miracle worker. He was a living demonstration that the impossible was simply another word for the inevitable when divine love met human faith. Every healing he had performed, every resurrection he had witnessed, every supernatural provision he had channeled was a preview of a reality that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. The revelation came as a series of interconnected understandings that flooded his consciousness like light breaking through storm clouds. He saw his own life from a perspective that transcended individual experience, recognizing how each encounter, each challenge, each moment of triumph and despair had woven together to create something larger than himself. His ministry had never been about proving divine power to skeptical minds. It had been about revealing divine love to wounded hearts. Every miracle was a love letter written by heaven to earth. Every supernatural intervention a reminder that human suffering was not the final word in any story. The sick were healed not merely to demonstrate divine ability, but to show divine compassion. The dead were raised not simply to display supernatural authority, but to declare that death itself was not the ultimate victor. In this moment of profound understanding, Elisha began to see the true scope of what he had been called to accomplish. His double portion of power had produced twice as many miracles as Elijah. But the real multiplication was not in the number of supernatural acts. It was in the expansion of human understanding about what was possible when heaven and earth worked in perfect harmony. The resistance he had faced throughout his ministry now revealed itself in an entirely new light. It had not been his enemy, but his teacher, shaping him into the kind of vessel that could carry divine power without being corrupted by it. Every criticism had refined his character. Every rejection had purified his motives. Every moment of loneliness had deepened his dependence on the God who had called him. He understood now why his ministry had been marked by such quiet humility rather than dramatic spectacle. In a world that valued noise and self-promotion, he had been called to demonstrate that true power often worked in whispers rather than shouts. His greatest miracles had happened not in temples or palaces, but in humble homes and beside forgotten roadsides, among people whose names would never appear in history books, but whose lives had been forever transformed by encounters with divine love. The echo of his revelation began to ripple outward, touching not just his own understanding, but the spiritual atmosphere of the entire region. Those who had witnessed his miracles began to see them with new eyes, recognizing in them not just isolated supernatural events, but glimpses of a reality where healing was normal, where provision was abundant, where death had no dominion. Stories began to spread with renewed power, carrying within them something that transcended mere historical account. They became seeds of possibility planted in hearts that had forgotten how to hope, reminders that the laws of nature were not chains that bound human destiny, but boundaries that divine love could transcend whenever compassion demanded it. The young prophets who had studied under his guidance found their own understanding expanding as they reflected on what they had witnessed. They began to realize that they had been privileged to observe not just a man who performed miracles, but a glimpse of what human existence looked like when it was perfectly aligned with divine purpose. Elisha had shown them that the sacred and the mundane were not separate realms, but different aspects of a single reality. Even his critics began to reconsider their positions as the full implications of his ministry became clear. The miracles could no longer be dismissed as tricks or coincidences, not because of their dramatic nature, but because of their consistent pattern of revealing divine character. Every supernatural act had reflected not arbitrary displays of power, but expressions of love that sought to heal, restore, and redeem. The revelation carried within it a prophetic dimension that extended far beyond Elisha's own lifetime. He began to understand that his ministry was a preview of something even greater that was yet to come. Every healing pointed toward a future when sickness would be no more. Every resurrection declared that death itself would one day be defeated. Every supernatural provision promised an age when scarcity would be replaced by abundance that never ended. This prophetic understanding filled him with both joy and longing. Joy for the privilege of serving as a herald of such magnificent promises. Longing for the fullness of their fulfillment when the glimpses he had been privileged to provide would become the permanent reality of human experience. In quiet moments, Elisha found himself overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey he had been privileged to walk. From the fields of Abel-Meholah to the courts of kings, from moments of doubt to experiences of supernatural power, every step had been leading toward this moment of understanding. He had been chosen not because of his qualifications, but because of divine love that sought to demonstrate its reality through willing human vessels. The echo of his revelation continued to expand, reaching hearts and minds across generations yet unborn. His story would become a reminder that the impossible was always possible.